How would you like to be one of the closest disciples, later to be an apostle of the Lord, and yet be told by Jesus, Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times? You may recall that in this particular case, and it's found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John as well, that our Lord said, not only will Judas deny me, but Peter, you're going to do so as well. Of course, as the text was just read, Peter adamantly denied the fact that he would deny the Lord. But of course, as we know, when that rooster crowed, he had done so. There's some mistakes that we're going to find here in the text that I think you and I need to look at, because unfortunately, we are far more like Peter than we'd like to admit from time to time. One of the first things we learn from this narrative is that we should never think that we are above any possibility of falling from God. Notice the text, verse 33 of Matthew 26. Even if all are made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble. You ever said never before? Sure we have. We've said never about a multiplicity of things. Well, I'll never end up in that kind of shape. I'll never have kids when we get married. I'm just not going to avoid that. I'll never get married. We may even say that. Well, I'll never make that kind of mistake. On and on we go with using never. Unfortunately, many times those nevers come back to haunt us, do they not? And then Peter even said, even if everybody else does it, I'll die for you, but I won't deny you. And we've often studied before that Peter was the impetuous one. He was the one that spoke up first among the 12. Oftentimes he spoke up before really thinking about what he was saying. I think this is one of those examples. One of the things I'm looking forward to of getting to eternity and hopefully being with God by His grace and by my faithfulness is being able to ask some questions of these people. I think recently in some of the Bible classes we've had as we studied Acts, the pioneers are probably tired of me saying, well, that's a good question to ask when you get there. Because I really think sometimes that's the only way to answer some of those questions is we just don't know what was going on or know everything that we need to know to be able to ascertain that. Well, here's a situation that I'd like to ask Peter about. How did you feel when the Lord told you, just like Judas, who probably Peter had suspected would be the one that would deny the Lord because he was the guy keeping the treasury box, and every time they did an accounting, less money showed up. So probably Peter had already figured that one out, along with the rest of them. But then to be told, you're also going to deny me. And Peter just was certain that that would never happen. I'm not going to ask you for your own personal narratives. I know I have mine. Of things that I've said that I'm ashamed that I did when I said I would never do that. No, it's not the worst things in the world, but it's sin, because we all do that from time to time. And the point of the matter is here's one of the very closest people of the Lord who had seen the Lord and had seen things that he and Peter and James were privileged to see that the other 9 had not seen. And yet it still did not keep him from saying one thing and doing yet another thing. You may recall that after Jesus' resurrection, that in John 21, Jesus has a one-on-one discussion with Peter. The first 2 times he asked the question, Peter, do you love me? Agapao, agape love. Guess what Peter's answer was? Lord, you know I like you. That's really the phrase that he used. He switched the words. He used a different word, phileo love, I believe it was. Yes, Lord, you know I'm, in one translation says it basically means have affection for. You know that I really like you, Lord. And then there in John 21, that finally Jesus just changed the phrase. Well, Peter, do you at least like me? Yes, Lord, I really do like you. You see, Jesus was trying to get Peter to understand. Peter, you denied me 3 times even after I had warned you beforehand. Now, what are you going to do now? After seeing that I've done everything that I said and that the prophets have said about me, I am the one and the only Son of God. And God did raise me from the dead. Now, what you going to do about it? 1 Corinthians chapter 10, 12. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. It's so easy, is it not, for us to think that there's never an opportunity that we'll ever fall against God. And yet over and over again we have the example of Peter, and I'm afraid the example of others who say one thing and do yet another. Don't be overconfident about your ability and your faith. Another thing we learn from this narrative: don't try to judge yourself apart from what you're dealing with. Later on in the text, Matthew chapter 26, verse 58, Peter followed from a distance to the high priest's courtyard, and he went in and sat with the servants to see the end. We could talk about for an hour about that phrase, the end. But isn't it interesting that Peter followed at a distance? That we've said before, and I know others have said before, that one of the problems that Peter caved in, or later on, is that he was so far away from the Lord. Unlike John, who had went in close to where Jesus was being tried and being questioned, Peter was just sort of far off away from everybody else. Think about it. It's much easier to be less effective and zealous for the Lord when you're farther and farther away from Him. Now think about that. The Lord had already told Peter before that rooster crows 3 times. And it would be easy for us to say, if I were Peter, isn't it easy for us to say that? If I were Peter, I would have been right there next to the Lord, so I wouldn't have been tempted to have done and said what I said. But we didn't know the rest of that narrative. And Peter didn't either, except he'd already been warned about it. Proverbs 24, verse 10 says, if you faint in the day of adversity, your strength is small. Think about it. How strong is your faith? How strong is your dedication to the Lord? How vibrant is your faith in God? And you're saying, and likely we would all be tempted to say, well, it's really faithful and it's really zealous and I'm on fire for the Lord. But what about when adversity comes our way? What about when something that we stand with or someone that we love with all our heart is no longer with us? Or when some adversity takes place, either in our life or someone that we love, and we wonder what to do. I have an idea that Peter's faith just had not really been tested. Now, it's easy to go back in Peter's narrative and Peter's life, and well, his faith was tested when he walked on water. Yeah, but how well did he do that? He sank, didn't he? And when the Lord when they're in Matthew chapter 16, when he asks the question, what do people say about me? And they give the answer, well, what do you say about me? He gives that great answer. You're the Christ, the Son of the living God. Do you remember the context of the passage? What happens almost immediately? Jesus begins to tell them, here's what's going to happen to me, and that I'm going to be tried and be tested and be killed. And Peter's over and said, "Lo, Lord, you're not going to go down that road." Do you remember what Jesus said to him? "Get behind me, Satan." It's easy to say what we would do when we're not in that situation. It's sort of like those before we had children as to how we would raise children versus those who were actually raising children. Anybody remember what I'm talking about? You know, it was so easy. When I worked as a youth minister, and Bonnie and I were just Bonnie and I, nothing, you know, nobody else. For me to handle those kids' problems as best I could, and then to know and to be glad that they were going home with their parents that evening. And I didn't have to solve all their issues. And I'd like to think that I kept my opinions to myself. Probably I didn't. But you know, it's so easy for someone who's not in that situation to make a judgment call. Well, I think that's what Peter is doing here. Lord, it doesn't matter about these others. And you can almost imagine Peter pointing the finger, can't you? Lord, even if they all deny you, I'll never deny you. In fact, Lord, I'll die for you before I deny you. And yet, just in a few moments, he curses and he swears and he curses and he swears and he curses and he swears again. And then that rooster crows. Another lesson. The more we do it, the easier it becomes. Verse 74, he began to curse and swear, saying, "I did not know the man," and immediately a rooster crowed. But see the context of the passage, verses 69, verse 72, what had happened? He had denied. You know, someone confronted him and said, "Oh, no, I don't know." And then later on, someone else brings up, and she brings a crowd of people and says, "He's got to be with him. I saw him with that Nazarene." And now he's in trouble because people have seen him in the company of the Lord. Think about it, people. You know, we said a moment ago, it's easier the farther away we are not to be as serious about a devotion, where the opposite is also true. Once you do it, it's easier to keep doing it. How many times have we failed? How many times when we say, "Well, I know church is important, but..." You heard about the two church members that were fishing one day on a Sunday. They were fishing. And they start fishing in the morning around time church start services, and they don't catch a thing for 2-3 hours. And so they're over there grumbling and complaining, and finally one of them says to the other, "Well, let's just admit it. We knew better than to fish on Sunday when we ought to be at church on Sunday." To which the other one said, "Well, we couldn't have gone to church anyway. One of the kids is sick." See the way we reason? That's the way, you know, we just, it just becomes so easy. Years ago in South Alabama, we had cards in the pews, and we had a fill-out sheet in regard to you know, things to pray about or things to write down about your family. And I remember one of our kids at that time, I think he was about 7 years old. He was able to at least write. And he wrote on the card, and one of the people picked up the card and handed it to me because he was in the youth program, or at least his parents or his kids, his brothers and sisters were in the youth program. And it said, "We couldn't come to church last week because Daddy said we all need to stay at home and guard the house from burglars." And so that was his reason for absentee, why they had missed church services. And so we were all trying to figure out who's going to take this to the parents and show it to them. I don't remember who got elected. It wasn't me. But, you know, the kid was telling the truth. You know, this is the truth. Probably that's not what the parents said. Think about it. The more you do it, the easier it is. And I guess it's easy for us to begin to rationalize it. You know, we don't know about, all we know about in this narrative found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Peter and John. Because the text tells us earlier that all the others had fled. They had already got out of Dodge. They were afraid that if they're going to crucify Jesus, they're going to come in after us as well. So I don't know where the rest of them are. You know, John's inside because he knows people, and he's inside where Jesus is. Peter's on the outside. And you can just imagine Peter saying, "Well, nobody's going to hear me say this. John's inside and the rest of them are gone, so to save my hide, I'll say what I'm thinking." I don't know if you've ever read Numbers 32:23, but it's got a message that we all need. "But if you do not do so, then take notice. You have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out." That passage has meant a lot to me in my life, or to others and to my family, because I have reminded others about that. Somehow, some way, be sure your sin will find you out. Another lesson we learn from this: a rooster crow is not the only way to wake us up. Sometimes a death, a calamity, a situation that we can't handle by ourselves has a way of making us realize life is serious and the end is nearer than we like to think, and we better be right with God. Sometimes tragedy or trauma will do the same thing. I've known of individuals, when they got the prognosis of cancer, they decided to get serious about the end of their life. And some of them actually changed and became New Testament Christians and were faithful the rest of their life because, as it were, God had given them a calling card, so to speak, and they realized it was serious. Well, sometimes it doesn't happen that way. But the point of the matter is, we all need that when something serious, when something happens to us or to someone that we love, we all need to realize, hey, there's a day of reckoning happening. And we better wake up and get in the real world and realize that if we don't change, if we don't be the kind of person that we need to be, like Peter, we will deny and we will deny and we will deny. When I was working on this sermon, I thought of several examples, but the one that I thought of the most was that person that we call the prodigal child. Do you remember where he was? Luke 15, verse 17, when he came to himself. Have an idea, until we come to ourselves, we'll never realize just where we are and what's going on and what we need to do to change. I think Peter realized that later on. From what we know after this event, and even after John 21 in regard to the resurrection of Christ, Peter's that first one that, as he and the rest of the apostles preached the first gospel sermon. And during the first few chapters of the book of Acts, it's all about Peter and what Peter's able to do. Acts chapter 10, Cornelius, the first Gentile convert, some of the great things that Peter does. He realizes that he had better start taking life seriously. But then there's one more lesson that I want us to remember as we close. And that is, in the midst of all the things that Peter did wrong, one cannot help but be amazed at the love of Jesus Christ. Verse 61, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he said to him, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. I want to ask you for just a moment, how did the Lord look at Peter that day? And again, you can say, that's one of those questions to ask when we get there, and probably we will, if it matters at all then. How do you think he looked? Disappointment, dismay, embarrassment, sadness. How do you look at your family, at your kids, your grandkids, or a church member when they've fallen away and not lived the life that they need to live? How do you look at them? How did Jesus look at Peter that day? And the more I thought about that question, this was the answer that I came up with. The same way he looks at us when we mess up. Because he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. He, yes, is the Son of God, but he's also the Son of man. He's that high priest through which we have and can have only the relationship that we want to have with God, through him being our mediator, through him being our sacrifice. Paul said it this way, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, you being rooted and grounded in love. Now think about that one. Rooted and grounded in love. May be able to comprehend with all the saints what's the width and the length and the depth and the height, to know the love of Christ, which passes knowledge. Notice the end result, that you may be all filled with all the fullness of God. When the rooster crows for each one of us, it would be far better if you and I were faithful to the Lord instead of denying the Lord. Peter learned that, and we need to learn that as well. The Lord wants us all to be right with him. He doesn't want anybody to walk out this building not in a right relationship with him. That's why he loves us that much. And that's why he gave us his life on cross of Calvary, so that you and I could be justified in him, just as if we had never sinned, through the right relationship with him today. If you don't have that, if you're not a New Testament Christian, or you're not the kind of Christian that you need to be, come home right now so that we